Flexibility.
Well, thank you guys for joining us this morning. Thank you to the Community Investment Corporation, Preservation Compact, the Institute of Housing Studies, and of course CZI. As Emily mentioned, my name is Noha Tripur. I work at National Housing Trust. I'm really excited to be joined by a great set of panelists this morning, who I'm going to briefly introduce before we get into our questions. So we're going to start alphabetically with Ruby Harris, who is the Senior Director of Capital Solutions and Partnerships at Enterprise Community Hub. Enterprise is a national nonprofit focused on the production and preservation of affordable housing. And Ruby's career has been centered around community-based real estate strategies with a broad range of experience. Something that I was actually thrilled to learn about Ruby when reading her bio is that she actually helped to create the San Francisco Small Sites Program, so we should talk about that later. An acquisition rehab program in San Francisco in partnership with the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. To my left is Raphael Leon, who is the CEO of the Chicago Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation, or CMHDC. And they are a nonprofit housing development agency focused on the preservation of non-subsidized affordable housing. Under Raphael's vision and leadership, CMHDC has actually grown to a market value close to $18 million in assets and over 700 rental units. So we're going to dig into that a little bit shortly. And last but not least, we have Steve Thomas at the very end. Steve is the president of 5T Construction, and as a real estate developer and general contractor, Steve has over 25 years of experience in construction projects. And prior to being a real estate developer, Steve was a restaurant owner and operator. So he planned, designed, and built over 20 restaurants across Chicago, Indiana, and Michigan. So please welcome our panel this morning. So I'm going to start with that last little bit of tidbit information about Steve. So when we talked, you mentioned that your family and you have a history of working in the restaurant industry. It's very different to affordable housing in many ways. So I wanted to start with if you could share a little bit about how you got started in the real estate development space and what drew you specifically to focusing on preserving NOAA properties, specifically in the south side of Chicago, which we know to be a historically disinvested neighborhood.
Good morning, everyone. I'll start. Classically trained as a systems engineer, Howard University graduate. So you can imagine initially when I went to the restaurant business, my parents were like, you got a college degree to become a restaurateur. So that was kind of interesting. But prior to the public housing being dismantled here in Chicago, we ran again 60 plus restaurants, and a lot of our employees live in public housing here. And we would always have issues with them getting to work, being to work on time, and just the day-to-day struggles they have living in public housing. And so one day we had an employee who called and said, hey, not sure if we're going to be able to make it work today, and typically, what's it today? And they held their phone out, and you could just hear gunshots, and they said, hey, they're having a battle, we don't think we're going to be able to get out. So my wife and I at that point thought to ourselves, how could we remove that impediment from their life? In order for them to become better employees, for them to grow with us, for our business to grow, we needed to figure out, it was beyond once they got to us, we needed to figure out how to reach out to them in order to remove these impediments. And so we initially purchased the building and said, hey, we'll move them from the public housing and put them in a building that we can control, that again, we feel that will be more stable for them and their families, so again, they can get to work on time, not have to worry about their families and whatnot. And so again, we went out, we did our initial loan with CIC, and one building turned into two turned into three, and we subsequently grew to just organically NOAA, about 500 plus units right now, predominantly on the south side of Chicago.
Cool, thanks. Thanks, Steve. And Raphael, I want to bring you in. Very different background and story. CMHDC has a very unique story as to how it started. I should mention everyone's bio is in, I think you can access it online, so you can read all about that. But CMHDC, you guys operate very much like a for-profit developer despite being a non-profit organization. So could you share a little bit about CMHDC's founding and your financial background and sort of how that has laid the foundation for you guys to just grow in the way that you have?
Thank you, Moa, and good morning, everybody. CMHDC was created in 1982 by the Chicago Housing Authority to issue bonds. So we issued about $200 million worth of bonds to finance project-based Section 8 developments. Those bonds were refinanced in the mid-90s, and as a result of the refinancing, we started getting some income stream. The savings, we were scheduled to get about $15 million of proceeds. The other $15 million, actually the savings were $30 million. Half went to HUD, half came to CMHDC. I came to CMHDC in 1996 with the purpose of helping the CHA with the redevelopment of public housing. And as my first few months, we started doing that. Unfortunately, CHA was in receivership. And the court said, not so fast, CMHDC. You cannot do anything related to public housing. So I found myself sitting at my desk saying, what are we going to do if we cannot help CHA? Well, we have the income stream from the refinancing of the bonds. And I said, well, let's start buying properties throughout the city. I went to banks to leverage the money that we have, and bank says, well, we don't know you. Why should we lend you money? And the moment that I said, what about if I put 50% down? The bank says, absolutely, where do we sign up? So we started small. We started with 6 buildings, and eventually grew to buy more 12-unit buildings, 24-unit buildings, the typical courtyard buildings here in Chicago. Now, one of the things that we did was, I'm a planner city planner is my background, and we decided not to invest in low-income housing areas. And the reason for that is that as a non-profit, we are obligated to provide low income. And we thought that it wouldn't benefit communities if we put more low-income housing. So since we have the resources, we decided to invest in gentrified areas, in areas that were changing, and preserve some low-income housing for the long term. And that's what we have done. We have invested in areas that are gentrified, that have gentrified over the years. For those from Chicago, we're in Evanston, Ravenswood, Rogers Park, Uptown, Oak Park. We're on the south side in Beverly. So we have invested in very good areas. The benefit of doing that was also the fact that the properties appreciated. So when we refinanced the properties, we were able to take some of the equity out and invest in other areas. So yes, we function more like a for-profit entity, but our mission remains the same, providing low-income housing.
Great, thanks, Raphael. And Ruby, so I know Enterprise is a national nonprofit. You guys have many aspects to the work that you guys do, all related to affordable housing. I know other Ruby spoke about this earlier, but she mentioned sort of the capacity building and the support that Enterprise has provided to LROC. So can you speak a little bit to how LROC got started, sort of why a hyper-local community-based strategy sort of spoke to Enterprise, your work, and sort of the overall approach to preserving and supporting affordable housing?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all for having me here. So happy to talk about the Local Rental Owners Collaborative, LROC, I'll call it for the rest of today. It's really, the LROC program started in 2021 at the heat of the pandemic, and part of the issue, which the other Ruby talked about a little bit already, was that small property owners are kind of lost in the mix of the conversation a lot of times. So we kind of start with conversations about acquisition and going, directly to rehab strategies. And this was a strategy that was really innovative because it's really focused on the property owners themselves, which is important, especially in a neighborhood like South LA, where the property owners are largely BIPOC, they're largely, and their tenants are largely also BIPOC. And come from families that may not have the same amount of intergenerational resources to be able to keep up with the demands of being a property owner through large changes in the economic environment. So LROC was a strategy that was very focused on the property owner, and I think that is super innovative. The Part of it that was interesting for us too is that because of that, we have in enterprise, we have a couple pillars of sort of what we're interested in creating throughout all of our work, and one of them is racial equity, the other one is upward mobility. So this speaks to not only stabilizing the BIPOC property owners, the communities that they serve, and the tenants that are there, but understanding that the reason NOAA exists in South LA is not natural. It's because of public policy, it's because of a history of discrimination that has happened in these types of areas, which are in all, that's in all of our cities, right? That happens and is perpetuated in all of our cities. There's a lot about it that was intentional. And so how are we turning those kind of systems around and starting to really focus on making sure that they're not going to lose their assets again, which happens sort of at each turn of the economy. And the last piece I just want to mention is that LROC is part of Enterprise's overall preservation strategy. We've got a lot of programs, like you mentioned, around preservation. We've got a national program called Preservation Next, which focuses on nonprofit acquisition and rehabilitation of small properties throughout the country. It includes grants, it includes capacity building and toolkits for nonprofits to be able to do this kind of work. And we're building on that now and really starting to work with our public sector partners in California. So everybody is, you're gonna hear it today, everybody is gonna say, well, we can't do all of our work without the money. The money has to be there, so how are we gonna do that? We're gonna engage with philanthropy, we're gonna engage with public sector partners and grow that body of work. And then we also have a full equity team that does equity investments into larger scale preservation. And then obviously we're also working with our existing nonprofit partners who are to preserve, existing deed restricted units too. So just like we think about it as a spectrum, all of them must exist together in order to protect our affordable housing ecosystem. And so that's why it's so important to us.
Great, thank you. I think it's something that all three of you have already touched on just in your first remarks, but I think to Steve and Raphael to start, maybe, you talked about sort of market conditions, neighborhood changes, cost dynamics. How are they sort of influencing your preservation strategies? Like, are you targeting certain neighborhoods? Do you take actions based on a property's sort of specific locations or typologies?
Again, we started on the south side of Chicago, and so as far as we kind of circle the wagons. And again, when you're first starting out, just as far as manpower, again, it doesn't make sense to be 10 miles away from properties when you can be on the same block. And so, growth strategy is really just about growing within your sector where you already exist, where you already have strength. You have strength from maintenance, you have strength from operations with property managers and your area managers. And so again, we have found that for us to be successful, we needed to grow our circle in diameter out. Current market conditions, again, because now we're 26 years plus, it's easy to pick off properties that are again within our current radius of buildings and be able to easily bring them into the marketplace that we currently have.
We're citywide, so we go wherever the opportunities are. But one thing that we did is we took the report that Jeff prepared a few years back and identified those areas as high-income areas where there may be opportunities to preserve affordable housing. So we get listings from brokers all the time. And for our purposes, what we're doing is we're converting market rate buildings into affordable buildings. The trouble that we have right now is the equity, raising the equity to buy those buildings. We use a lot of the equity that we had in the past. So now we have to be creative about where the money comes to put down to buy the properties. What I said at the beginning about 26 years ago about the bank saying, well, how much money do you put down? 50%. Okay, let's sign the loan. It's still true today. I mean, if you go to a bank and ask for a loan, they're going to say, where's your equity? And that's what we have to deal with right now, especially with the high interest rates that we're facing right now. It requires more equity. So raising that equity becomes critical. But we go all over the city where we see the opportunities to preserve low-income housing for the long term. We strongly believe that people who have lived in communities for a long, long time should continue living there in a way that is affordable to them.
Great. And then, sort of, Ruby, I know you are not based in Chicago, so I wanted to sort of get your perspective on how the changing sort of neighborhood markets in South LA are then also influencing the decision-making and the strategies of the LROC members that are there.
Yeah, so South LA is a big swath of Los Angeles, and I described it a little bit already, but there's a high proportion of people who are living under the poverty line. There's a high proportion of immigrants. There's a high proportion of people with small children living there. There's a lot of sort of layers of sort of needs in that community, and the pandemic hit communities like that really hard everywhere, harder than the rest of the city was hit. And so when we were working along with Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to try to figure out what is the right neighborhood, that was a really big part of it. One of the things that's important to note about LROC owners is, in addition to being BIPOC, they're local. Like, it's in the name, but I don't think we mentioned that yet. About 60% of them actually live in the neighborhood, and many of them also live in one of their buildings that they own. So they have like a really strong interest in making sure that the community stays put. When we did a survey of them, most of them have lived in the neighborhood for more than 10 years, some of them 40, 50 years. So they've been there for a long time, they're rooted, these are their neighbors, they are very interested in continuing to serve the community in an affordable way. The issues that were coming up are what we all know. There's like increases in operating expenses, increases in maintenance costs, decrease in rent receipts. And so there's a lot of pressure on these owners who don't like, when you think about, when people outside of this room think about landlords, they're often thinking about like people who have a lot of resource and sort of evil, for lack of a better term, and that is not how we think about that at all. We're really thinking about that local ownership, and it's a stronghold for communities, and how do we keep that in place. So I think that you know, just all of those aspects together play into why LROC was created the way it was, to really support them with their operations, support them with their maintenance needs, do the capital piece, but also capacity building so that they can better manage the portfolios into the future. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
For sure. And you touched on this, and I want to dig in this a little bit more, Raphael, what you mentioned in terms of the necessity to have a certain amount of equity to like sort of combat that with current high interest rates. What are maybe some of those central preservation challenges that you're seeing in the markets where you operate? So for Raphael and Steve here in Chicago, Ruby in LA.
Well, I mean, expenses keep going up. The impact that we're having in our communities, in our building, we shouldn't dismiss that, because our rents are somewhere between $200 and $300 less than what the market rents are for that area. So that's an impact that we're having in the communities, in those buildings. For all purposes, our rents are lower than what the city and IDA rents are, 50% below the maximum of 80% of median income. So in order for us to preserve that and to move forward, we decided to create an equity fund. And thank you, Patrick Mueller from Chase, who has been guiding us in crystallizing how we need to talk to investors and to philanthropy to raise money, because it becomes critical. If you don't have that equity money, you're not going to create affordable housing. It's the same with the LIHTC transactions. If you don't get an allocation of the LIHTC, which raises your equity, you're not going to do that transaction. We do it differently, and we do it more cost efficiently. I mean, our per unit cost is somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000. It's more efficient than the LIHTC. So for us, it's critical to continue developing those resources to bring equity into the market so we can buy more buildings and preserve them for the long-term affordability.
I guess I would say how quickly these transactions happen, and organizations or the buyers in some of these transactions being able to get the right kind of capital fast enough and to be able to buy them within whatever 30 or 45 days that you need to take down a site. Is really important. And then the other piece that I think is critical is just the economies of scale. So really interesting to think about like how you do things locally, how you do have projects be in the same space so that you can create that scale that you need to make this efficient.
I think one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing on the south side of Chicago is that we have been discovered by everyone outside of Illinois. And so they really don't understand the local market, and so they look at something and they're saying it's undervalued because in Brooklyn I'm paying X, or on the West Coast I'm paying X, and so why is this so low? And so again, what's happening is prices are being driven up artificially, and it's again increasing costs. And they really don't understand the market, which is again driving local developers out. But again, if you really look at the cycle of this money that's being bought into Chicago, these groups are failing one after another, and then they're just leaving a trail of debris behind, which is really people's lives. They're forcing people out of their neighborhoods, and it's just not a good thing for, it's hard to maintain a healthy neighborhood, a healthy community, when you just have money that's just being thrown at something, but they really don't know what they're doing.
If I could say something, because as part of our equity fund, we got a grant from Chase of $500,000. And the purpose was to explore how that money would work in an investment to create more affordable housing. So we used $400,000 of that money and went out and bought a 10-unit building in Oak Park. Oak Park in Chicago is it's a suburb of Chicago, but it's a very stable area. So that's the leverage that we can get by raising capital. With that $400,000 grant that we got, we went out, identified a building, and bought the building. And that preserves affordable housing for the long term in a community that is pretty upper middle income.
I want to pivot a little to talking maybe a little bit more about solutions. So talk sort of a bit about what your work involves, some of the challenges you guys are facing, sort of how you're thinking about your preservation strategy. I want to think a little bit about like what's helped you do that preservation work, and kind of targeting each of you like a different kind of solution. So maybe Ruby, I'll start with you. Capacity building, I think, is a really important aspect of preservation. We obviously have 2 5-star developers here today, but recognizing that not all owners start off like that, end up like that, and have access to sort of financial resources and the right policies and programs in that preservation ecosystem to do that work. And I think to LROC's point specifically, help to maintain that local ownership. So I'm wondering what types of support you've found to be most critical for these LROC property owners in terms of capacity building and sort of how they responded to the resources and the technical assistance that you guys are providing.
Yeah, thank you. So one thing I want to start out with is that we really, for the first couple of years of the pilot, were focused on capital. It was about making sure people were stable first before you start adding on to that and thinking about the portfolio in the long term. Kind of have to get people out of crisis mode. And we did have 35% of our LROC owners told us that they were able to avoid foreclosure because of LROC. So that was a real threat at the beginning. And so I just want to start with there. That those first 2 years with the REER's help and with some help for repairs, the capital work right off the bat were really important. Then after that, we were able to start building. And so as those relationships built and everything, and we actually did a round of physical needs assessments on all the buildings, and so that people could really understand their assets in a better way. These are property owners who own 10 or less units, so they may not have done physical, they have not done physical needs assessments before, and to think about, well, so what are the capital infusions that are going to be needed over time? What are immediate needs and longer term needs and all of that stuff? And then we did training with them so that they could understand what those reports say. Now we're building on to that, and so doing a lot more capacity building nowadays. We're doing financial coaching, which includes personal coaching, you know, on your finances, working on portfolio management sort of coaching, thinking about, do you need to refinance something and take some equity out and infuse that into the property now? And then most recently, we're starting to do some estate planning, understanding that people, a lot of times where they're losing their assets from generation to generation is at a death. So working with people on estate planning as well. One of the other things that they flagged for us, our property owners are very involved in how the project commences, is that they needed help with legal. Again, these are property owners that don't have the resources to go out and pay their own attorney to do a lot of this. So we're doing webinar-based legal, you know, webinars so that people, like the issues that they're very interested in, we can cover that as a group. And then if they have specific issues, they go and pay for the attorney to handle that issue versus sort of just general legal, you know, advice or instruction. The other thing is this idea of collective power building. So there's a lot of the work that CRCD does with our owners on the ground is organizing. It's bringing them together. They do quarterly webinars. We have a leadership team who are 9 of the 52 owners who are really dedicated to driving LROC forward, and they're interested in how to build power for themselves. One of the things that is true is that they feel that none of the apartment associations speak for them. None of them. They're very much more mission-oriented and less profit-oriented than what they feel the apartment associations generally try to do. So LROC is the one place where they feel like they're heard and where they can be heard by the city. And so they have started to have conversations with the city, which was a really exciting first meeting happened this year. And sort of building on that, we're working with them to figure out if there can be a standalone LROC entity in the future that they can all be members of and have authority over, that will sort of after the pilot ends. And then the last thing that I'll mention is that we provide resources. So we have a list of contractors they can go to that have been vetted, that other people have used in their group, so that they just have a more simple way to go find an electrical contractor or somebody to do their roof than they would have had otherwise. They use that list a lot. And then they get to use CRCD's project management skills, so helping them with those projects. And then they have one-on-one assistance available to them too. So there's a lot of capacity building that goes in there, and all of them are sort of like what makes LROC pretty strong.
Yeah, no, that sounds great and sounds very impactful and also necessary. I think even if I was gonna buy a NOAA property, I wouldn't even know where to start. And so you kind of need that support to be here's sort of how you go through the motions and reserve this housing. Here's who you can talk to. Here are the resources available to you that already exist. Great. And I think we've all sort of talked about this, but Steve, I want to touch on something that you've also been talking about in terms of accessing financing. Having and building equity to sort of do this work is so important, as Raphael has even mentioned. And so hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about the kinds or types of financing that have been really important to you or that your firm has access to sort of acquire, rehab, and preserve these NOAA buildings.
Yeah, locally there's a small organization, CIC here in Chicago.
I've heard of it.
They have been the rock that we kind of build our business on, and they offer acquisition rehab loans to individuals. So again, it's the first time that you can go into an organization, present a plan. They'll walk you through it. They have construction managers on site. They also offer training for property managers and other training for small A developers, individuals, in order to learn about the business, what they need to do to understand that this is a business. Whether or not you have one building or two buildings, it's a business, and so again, they have the educational tools there that teach you that. But again, they also will walk you through the construction. So again, you will present your information to them. They have construction managers that not only protect CIC's lenders, but also you as an owner in order to walk you through. So again, I think that's a huge tool that you have in order to finance. And again, you can get your building stabilized and then move it over to a Chase or to a GSE, so forth and so on. I think another local tool that we have here in Chicago is that in our regions, we have actual owner builders groups. And so we meet monthly. And so on the south side, there's a builders group. On the west side, Lincoln Park, north side. And so again, collectively, we all get together because we all experience the same problems or have the same questions. So again, it gives us a community in order to exchange information, best practices, so forth and so on.
Great, yeah, I mean, both of you have talked just about how important having that community is in doing this work. Raphael, I wanted to sort of end with you, sort of the work of CMHD. You guys are operating in these higher cost gentrifying markets, and that is challenging for preservation-minded owners. So I wanted to sort of dig in a little bit to that and sort of better understand, like, what is it that allows CMHDC to act so nimbly, especially in the current environment? And also sort of touch on, are there any sort of non-financing tools or policies that are sort of helping to support you guys in your work to preserve affordability?
That's a really broad question. It doesn't apply to CMHDC alone. I think that it has to be a concentrated effort from policymakers to concentrate, to have policies related to the preservation of non-subsidized affordable housing. When people talk about affordable housing, what comes to mind? It comes the subsidized light type of transaction. So we need to change our mentality about talking about affordable housing. There is a broad spectrum of non-subsidized affordable housing, and I think that policymakers, funders, the philanthropic community need to focus on that aspect and see how they can work to facilitate and maintain and preserve affordable housing. Otherwise, especially in high-income areas, that housing will go. And for us, it becomes very difficult to preserve if we don't have the resources and we don't have the support to preserve that housing for the long term. The impact of preserving in middle-income, high-income areas is that families don't have to be displaced. They could remain where their children went to school, closer to their jobs. They have amenities that they may not encounter somewhere. So there is a lot of impact for the families to remain in those areas. So I think that it's not just one solution. The financing clearly is something that is needed, at least for us, in terms of raising the equity that we need to buy more buildings. Because if I have $30 million, that's our plan for the equity fund. We want to raise $30 million. If I had $30 million, I could easily raise somewhere between $60 and $90 million in debt. Then all of a sudden I have $120 million to invest in preserving affordable housing. That's what we did in the past. We have $15 million. We bought buildings. Those buildings appreciated. We refinanced, and the portfolio right now has a value of somewhere between $80 and $100 million. So that's the way to work to preserve affordable housing that is not subsidized.
I'd just like to add on Raphael too. When he talks about preservation, when you start talking about the big A with line tech deals, where today in Chicago they're pricing out at about $600,000 a square foot, or $600,000 for a unit. We can do a complete rehab for $60,000. So again, that's a huge difference. And also as another tool, Raphael and I worked tirelessly with others in this room to get a tax reduction program back in Chicago. So again, as Raphael said, it's about the coalition of city and state working together in order to help reduce costs for affordable housing.
That's great. I have a couple of questions I didn't actually tell either of you, any of you I was going to ask you, but I think this is an easy question. I think sort of want to give our audience the opportunity to sort of think about some questions they might have for our expert panelists, but I have a couple of last questions for all of you. So first one is sort of reflections. So for Steve and Raphael, you guys have been in this industry for many years, you've grown your portfolios. Like, what do you sort of maybe wish you knew, or something that you would want to impart on some, you know, new kind of newer owners into the industry that you want to share with them? And maybe sort of a slightly different question for you, Ruby. You know, we had earlier this morning, and I think even some of your other enterprise colleagues have mentioned you guys are planning to sort of expand the LROC model to other jurisdictions and think about how can you support these smaller developers in other jurisdictions. So maybe any lessons learned from what you guys have done in Los Angeles that you're thinking about imparting to, you know, the LROC model elsewhere. Anyone wants to speak about lessons learned or some reflections?
Okay, I'll get that started. I mean, so part of the strength of LROC is a really strong philanthropic partner, honestly, because it's flexible capital that's been able to be used over time. We're able to change, you know, like Ruby mentioned earlier, change sort of direction depending on what the owners needed. So that's not available everywhere. But that is something that I think more and more we need to be having conversations with our philanthropic partners to build sort of momentum around this. And then the other piece that I'm jazzed about is just getting in there and talking to more and more public sector partners about this type of work. And you know, specifically for LROC type owners, there are specific sort of capital interventions that need to happen and grants that could happen. And then for nonprofits, sort of further down the line, other types of interventions for that type of rehab work. So I don't know if that answers your question, but sort of I think it's important to have really flexible, longer term, bigger sort of tranches of money to help small property owners do what they need to do.
I would say it's not for the faint of heart. And you know, I talk to younger guys coming into the market now, and you know, they'll ask, "How I be you?" And you know, I think that they need to have a different vision. You know, that's just like in the 80s, if you went to investment banking, the tide rose, and you didn't have to be good. You just rode it up, and you just have to do it. And so, yeah, I think that you need to be very intentional. I think you have to understand and care about the people that you're serving. If you don't, and if you're only doing it for money, you will fail. You know, this has become more than about housing. It's really providing the social services that our residents need, and helping them, you know, through whatever they're going through. Because again, you're in it together. You know, once you choose a resident, and you know, you all are partners, so you got to be able to work it out. So again, I would stress that you really need to understand and want to give back to the community if you plan to be successful in this job.
You know, a few years back, somebody asked me, why don't you do light tech transactions? And I said, why would I? It's so much complicated. I mean, our life is so much easier. Why would I go out and start competing for transactions that, first of all, I didn't know how to do, and I still don't know how to do light tech, and I understand it, and I know it, but know what you can do and stick with that. I think that we have been very successful preserving affordable housing at a fraction of the cost of publicly subsidized transactions. That's good. Recognize when you have to get out of a transaction. There has been investments that we have made that didn't perform as we expected, and we keep track of our portfolio. For 3 years, we put any property, we keep a watch on every property. If in 3 years we don't get the results that we want, then it's time to sell that property to a local investor, most likely, because they're present in the community. So recognize when you can make an investment and when you have to get out of that investment, because I've been with CMHDC for 28 years. We have never lost any money in any transaction, whether properties that we have right now or properties that we sold. We got out of transactions that we saw were not performing, so it's better to get out and let somebody else handle that. So it's good to recognize what you can do.
I think it's all really good, helpful advice and reflections. So last question before the audience questions you all. And I think both Ruby and Raphael, you both mentioned sort of the need for philanthropy to sort of be a part of this conversation, and so maybe something to think about for our next panelists. But we do have a pretty broad audience here today. We have policymakers, lenders, government officials, fellow developers. And so what advice would you have for them, or what would you want them to know about if they want to support the work that you guys are doing, whether it is policy, whether it is program, whether it is funding, something else?
I will go with funding. I think that people need to realize that if an investor makes an investment in affordable housing, they're meeting a purpose. They can make some profit. They're not going to make a 20% or 25% return, but they can still make some profit. For philanthropy, is a way of investing in communities for the long term. They don't expect a return, but they have an impact on the community, on the preservation and those families that we're housing. So it's critical for them to recognize that. For the investors are the most difficult to deal with because they have certain criteria. They need to start thinking outside the box about what it means to preserve affordable housing.
Maybe that goes to your earlier point about when we think about affordable housing, it's very high-tech focused, and the different needs of smaller or maybe more NOAA-focused preservation.
Yeah, think of affordable housing two ways: subsidized affordable housing and non-subsidized affordable housing. And you can do really good work in non-subsidized affordable housing.
I think that the policy and political structure needs to, again, parse down to the level of a lot of the individuals that is providing this affordable housing. Case in point, the electrification, and it's a good thing, but when you start talking about low-income housing here in Chicago, electrification will probably increase a low-income household in the winter here $25, $30 a month, which may not seem like a lot to some people, but when you're living, check to check, that $35, and I've spoken to my residents, they are more concerned about saving $35 than you telling them something that might happen to them 40 years down the line. And so again, I think that we need to just understand what some of these changes that we're talking about, how it impacts someone living today. And again, how we can help them subsidize those changes so that, one, it's a win-win today for them as well as tomorrow.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on that. That I think one of the things that we can't do is just say, okay, we did all this arrears help just for the pandemic. Because the problem persists. We're continuing to have, the tenants are continuing to have trouble, paying their monthly rents. We have arrears upon arrears at this point in all kinds of affordable housing and market rate housing. And so I'll lean into the public sector side of that, in that I think that we can do more that is focused on the property owners receiving that arrears assistance. It worked really well with LROC with a private funder, but how are we doing that continuing to do that on a public side? And it also, gives relief to the tenants, obviously, and gives an opportunity for people to mediate, to work on a payment plan, to figure out how they're going to, get out of, dig out of sort of that arrears issue. The other thing is that repairs loans for small property owners are really important. Low interest repairs loans for small property owners. In LROC, the owners are really willing to take some sort of subsidy, and in exchange say we'll do some affordability. It's not going to be 15 years, 55 years, 99 years, nothing like that, but 1 or 2 years they're happy to do that for small amounts of sort of subsidy to help them through some of their repair needs. So one of the things that we're doing right now is setting up an LROC loan fund that would provide 10 to 20,000, which is what they're saying they need. So it's like a small amount of money that would make a big impact for some of them to be they don't have that cash, but they could pay for their roof and then pay it down over time. And so that's something that we're going to start launching soon for LROC. And I think that cities and counties could be doing that too. And the other thing is thinking about that is how we're connecting these small property owners to the ACT rehab strategies in any local municipality. And just, again, making sure that that subsidy for ag rehab is there so that there's some place for those properties to go when somebody passes away or they just want to get out of the business.
Could I ask something about philanthropy? Because for many years I was told by foundations, we don't fund bricks and mortar. I think that has changed a little bit, but they need to recognize that yes, you're investing in facilitating bricks and mortars, but the end beneficiary are the families and individuals, low-income families who live there and still have access to their community. So I think that the philanthropy, the foundations need to start thinking about, yeah, we don't fund bricks and mortars, we don't get into financing or providing funding to buy buildings. You're facilitating that, but the end goal is to ensure that families and individuals continue living in those communities that are otherwise, they will be displaced.
Yeah, that's a really important sort of final message to say. Like, we're all in this room not because, we obviously enjoy the work that we do, but it's meaningful because of who we're trying to serve and who that end user is. So we do have some time for some questions, and I believe Maggie is around with a roving microphone. So maybe we can start at the front here with some questions.
Is it indeed a broken microphone? It's not. Good.
Maybe it was just me.
Good morning, Andrew Stables with DL3 Realty, project development, project manager, doing a lot of the LIHTC side, so I totally agree with you. There's a lot of opportunity in this. But I have two questions, one quick for Ruby and one for Steve. Ruby, I was curious if the LROC, if there any of the reports from like the initial work you've done or what you're trying to do moving forward are available, if there's any resources. And then for Steve, my question was, hit the nail on the head in what PL3 does. We've seen some of those outside investors come in and check out prices. I was wondering if there's anything you see as a potential solution to some of the challenges that's happening on the south side when you're dealing with acquisitions. Thank you.
So to answer your question about the LROC reports, we are working on sort of winding down the pilot phase of the program right now, which includes, we have a lot of reports and data that we've collected, but it includes a final evaluation of the entire program, the entire pilot phase of the program. And so we expect to be publishing that and sort of sharing it more publicly towards the middle of next year. But happy to talk offline about anything that we've learned in the meantime. Yeah.
I'm kind of torn with the premise of outsiders coming in, because again, I'm originally from Washington D.C. I think I've done good work, and so I think it's more so about good actors coming in, and so. That's just a fine line that I kind of have to think about. With the pricing though, as an owner and you're trying to sell, you're trying to get the highest price. And so, that becomes very difficult to wrestle with because two is more than one. And, that owners typically going to take that highest bidder and go from there. So, I think, from our perspective, my perspective, being on the ground for 26 years, you make relationships with owners. Those owners actually see what's happened to the neighborhood and how neighborhoods have gone up or down over the past 25 plus years. And so again, to me, that gives me a competitive edge because they see the work that we do and they're saying, okay, you'll be a good steward of this and we'll continue on. So again, I think it's about, being part of the fabric of the community. And I think that those who are fabric of that community, I believe that they'll win.
Hi, my name is Joanne Oddie with the Chicago Community Trust. So, Raphael, you mentioned a kind of call to policymakers to preserve affordable housing. I am wondering I would love to hear, especially from Chicago, but I'd also love to hear from you, Ruby, particularly with this kind of collective power building across owners, if there are policies that they're advocating for in California. but I'd especially love to hear in Chicago what policies you have seen that have been effective in preserving naturally occurring affordable housing, and which ones you would advocate for in the future. I mean, I'm sure many of us have heard about policies around the 606 or community benefits agreements, but I would love to hear your perspective.
What policy? God, that's a tough question because I haven't heard of many. In terms of preserving non-subsidized affordable housing, the fact is that there is none. In my view, I could be completely wrong, but having heard a specific policy that says we're going to preserve non-subsidized affordable housing, except for saying we need to preserve non-subsidized affordable housing. And when push comes to shove, I don't see any action, specific action about that. I mean, the Preservation Compact was the first time when Julia Stash was the commissioner at the MacArthur Foundation that studied the Preservation Compact. Let's create a fund to preserve affordable housing, and that's how the Preservation Compact started many years ago. And it's great. I mean, it provides a lot of financing for small property owners. But again, if you don't have a portion of that equity to invest, you're not going to get the transaction done. So it's got to be some effort, a policy that decides, we're going to create this fund that if Steve needs $200,000 to go out and buy the building, fine, we'll record that as a second mortgage, maybe 0% interest for 10 years, provided that he preserves affordable housing. So there's got to be some way of doing it, but in terms of a specific policy, I haven't heard anything.
Yeah, I guess I would, I talked a little bit about like the capital interventions that they're looking for from the public sector. And I guess there's systems interventions too. Like one of the things that they're very clear on is that they feel that the city boxes them out a lot. Like they don't have access to subsidies from the city, even the ones that are available, because it's so difficult to apply, it takes so long, the money doesn't come in on time. There's like all of these sort of grievances with the city and their processes. So when they did have that opportunity to sit down with the city's housing staff, it was a lot of like, streamline everything, the applications need to be simple, these are all folks who have full-time jobs, and this is like their investment on the side. And so asking them to do very complicated like income certifications and all kinds of sort of data that they need to collect in order to apply, I think are impediments to them using them. And then the other piece that they've mentioned to us several times is that they are really open to having placements from you know, the aging, you know, for adult services from different parts of the city. But those systems, like they call, I have a vacancy, can you guys help place somebody? And then they never get a call back. So things like that, where there's problems in the actual, like the communication that's happening, and I would call those more like systems level, how implementation is happening on the ground in a city of, you know, 4 million people. So there are a lot of those kind of quirks to a big city like that.
No, I really can't think of any, again, outside of the Preservation Compact that comes together. Yeah, it's, you know, little A is kind of forgotten. And again, I think that depending upon where you are in the U.S., you know, Chicago just has a lot of little A's versus large A's that, again, we're kind of an unheard voice. And again, it's really organizations and events like this that we kind of get to share what's going on in, you know, 70% of the neighborhoods in Chicago.
If I could say something about the community trust, MacArthur, Addison left. But in fact, maybe that's a role for the foundations. Start thinking about what are the policies to preserving naturally occurring affordable housing. Start developing those policies that you can talk about, and you guys have access to an incredible wealth of knowledge and access to capital, access to individuals who have experts. Maybe you need to convene a group that starts talking about that.
I think we have time for one more question.
Can I say one quick thing?
Yes.
I will use my bully pulpit here. So the Preservation Compact for 15 years has been developing policies, sort of, a patchwork in order to facilitate more naturally occurring affordable housing. That is the property tax incentive that you guys were talking about before. That was the Preservation Compact, bringing all these people together. Energy incentives, building code. There are a lot of things that can be done on a patchwork basis that really matter. Financing, funding, great, but at the end of the day, a lot of that is public sector, and it doesn't work as well for the naturally occurring affordable housing folks. So I just want to say that Compact is that group, and these strategies that I just mentioned came from, this group of actors and stakeholders who really care about preserving NOAA. So I just have to say that in Chicago, there are a bunch of great policies, and there's a lot of talk about.
It's time to rent it.
That's right. No need to reinvent the wheel. All right, one final question, and then we will take a break.
Thank you guys so much for what you're doing. I'm incredibly grateful. Here's another policy, for good or bad. The city of Chicago is now experimenting with giving tenants rights of first refusal when buildings are being sold. It started in Woodlawn around Obama, and they just as of this month, they're experimenting on the northwest side. My question is that a disincentive, unfair to owners, or is it an incredible opportunity for groups like CMHDC and 5T to come in and work with those tenants and help them buy the buildings?
I think that is both a disincentive, but also an opportunity for groups like us to work with tenants. I'm torn with that. I believe that property owners have the right to sell their buildings, that they shouldn't have restrictions on who to sell. And typically, in a real estate transaction, you want to close on a transaction within three months. You enter into a contract and you sell it. That ordinance, as I understand it, requires the tenants, give the tenants 4 months to consider buying the building. If they don't buy it, if they cannot do it, they can partner with somebody. It's an opportunity for us, but also I think that you need to respect the rights of the property owners to sell the building. Now, the other part of that ordinance is also that there will be a fee of $60,000 for demolition of a building. That, to me, is a disincentive to provide affordable housing. Why? Because the next buyer, if that buyer decides that he's going to tear down the building and build a for sale building or a rental, guess who's going to pay the $60,000? The buyer of the units or the renters who are going to be there? The developer is not going to assume that. They'll pay it up front, but eventually they'll recover it. So it increases the cost of housing.
So I think there are other ways to increase affordable housing than putting restrictions on owners' private property. But again, typically, money that is flowing through the state, the city, for affordable housing, if it could be diverted and go to organizations like CIC, we could provide more affordable housing with $5 million, $10 million going to a CIC versus going to the city. And so again, I think there's some other ways that we could increase the affordable housing supply side on the south side or through Chicago in general.
Great. Well, thank you to Raphael, Ruby, and Steve. Please join me in thanking
Thank you.